Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the second event in the Fall 2022 series of the City Talks on the theme of climate change and energy transitions in the city. My name is Ruben Rose Redwood, and I'm the Associate Dean Academic in the Faculty of Social Sciences and a professor in the Geography Department at the University of Victoria. And I'm also the chair of the committee for the UVic Committee for Urban Studies, which organizes the City Talks. I'd like to begin by first acknowledging that this event is taking place on the traditional territories of the Lekwungen peoples, as well as acknowledge the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples whose historical relations with the land continue to this day. I'd also like to acknowledge the support of our sponsors, which include the Faculty of Social Sciences, the Faculty of Engineering and Computer Science, the Department of Geography, the Department of Civil Engineering, all at the University of Victoria, which have supported the City Talks this year. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, my colleague, Dr. Christina Hoicka, who is a Canada Research Chair in Urban Planning for Climate Change, and is also a cross-appointed faculty member in the Departments of Geography and Civil Engineering. She holds degrees in engineering, ecological economics, and geography, with a primary research focus on the geography of renewable energy, or transitions, community energy, energy citizenship, and the diffusion of low carbon innovations in Canada as well as in the European Union. And tonight, Christina will be talking about why renewable energy in the city is a regional issue. So with that being said, let's give Christina Hoicka a nice warm welcome to the City Talks.
Two computers tonight. So hopefully this works. Thanks so much, Ruben. Thanks everybody for coming out. I hope that you can hear me on this microphone. I guess I have to stand this way a little bit closer. I want to start by acknowledging the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory UVic stands, and also the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationships to the land continue today. Very grateful to live here in Victoria, and I moved here a little bit over a year ago, so I've been here for a little while. Okay, the outline of the talk, I want to talk about how renewable energy transitions in a city relate to the region, but I'm first going to talk a bit about renewable energy and climate change, why it's important. I want to also take a bit of time to contextualize renewable energy and address myths. I've done quite a bit of media work in the last year or so, and I do a lot of public events, and I think it's really important to take the time to address some aspects of renewable energy that people may not know, and just to clarify some things. Then I'm going to talk about cities and energy, and then I'll get to the point, the punchline, which is why renewable energy in the city is a regional issue. And I'm also going to relate this to justice and energy transitions, and end this with a case study of some research that I'm doing with my lab, and a few of the members of the lab are here right now, around Indigenous leadership in renewable energy in BC. So why renewable energy for climate change? These charts are from a few years ago, but I'll be honest, very little has changed since then, so there's no need to really update them that much. On the left-hand side, we've got charts that show that fossil fuel use has continued to grow. I think this year's might be the first year that has plateaued, if anything. If we want to address climate change, though, and reduce the impacts, the most disastrous impacts, we need to basically cut our fossil fuel use in half by 2030, and then completely by 2050. And so if we have it going up or plateauing, that's not getting us to where we want to be. And that's been the trend for quite some time. On the right-hand side is one scenario from the International Energy Agency. It's not the scenario, but really what it shows is what would we need to have happen in order to address climate change. And what you can see on the top in the green and blue colors is the exponential growth of renewable energy. And what you see below that is the reduction in things like natural gas and coal and other fossil fuel use. The use of natural gas in this chart is still higher than I'd like to see it, but it's there. And in some cases, fossil fuels will have to be used. So I'd like to contextualize renewable energy and address some of the myths. Sorry, I'm working on 2 screens right now. This is what an energy transition looks like. At the top, I've got a diagram of what the old energy system looked like. It was centralized generation, generally nuclear power, fossil fuels, coal power. And these would be very, very large power plants, and then they would produce electricity, send it along the power line in one direction, then it would go to the transmission, then distribution, and then it would end up with the end consumer. And so it was all centrally planned. It was very easy to get it from point A to B because there weren't as many issues around land use and that type of thing when these systems came about over 100 years ago. Our new renewable energy systems are going to be made up of different types of technologies and different geographies. So one piece of it will be these supergrids, and supergrids will be made up of their new transmission lines. They'll be made up of new materials. They will carry lots and lots of power, very long distances, in order to bring power from one area to another. We'll also have smart grids, and we have those coming into play right now. And smart grids are basically a way of managing our electricity so that we have more reliable electricity and we reduce the number of outages, we can recover much more quickly, and we can also have a lot more flexibility in them, which I'll talk about in a moment. And then the last piece is on the right-hand side is a microgrid. And a microgrid is bringing together energy users in a different way. They might become producers. This is where we'll have things like electric vehicles. We'll have battery storage where we'll charge batteries and then we'll use it when we need more electricity. We'll have distributed generation, which is local generation. And these microgrids are connected to the grid sometimes, but also sometimes they're isolated from the grid. And so during major storms like hurricanes and stuff, what they've found is that microgrids have offered a lot more resilience and the power has stayed on in those microgrids, whereas main grids, the power went out. This transition, though, is not just about technology. It's about decentralization of technology, but it's also about bringing in new actors into the energy system who are going to be participating as producers in this system. And they could be small and medium enterprises, citizens, municipalities, local authorities, and communities. And they all have new roles and responsibilities in this system. And this is where a lot of the change and the challenges and the aspects around justice are going to come in, because this is all really different and really new. So the next thing, what are renewable energy technologies and innovations? And so this is from a publication we had recently. Renewable energy transitions are going to be made up of a lot of different types of technologies. So we're going to have hydropower still. We might have large hydropower. We might have small hydropower, wind power, solar power, biomass, biofuels. But we're also going to have these, what we call flexibility technologies. So we'll have battery storage, we'll have electric vehicles, we'll have demand response, which is people and households and businesses shifting their response. The amount of electricity they use in response to these other things. It's also about heat pumps, combined heat and power, and really importantly in cities, waste heat recovery. Waste heat recovery, for example, in this chart, is about looking for our sources of waste heat or our sources of waste cooling, and then finding locally where we can sell that or share it in district energy. So in City of Toronto right now, they are taking waste heat from sewage waste, which is like body heat, and they're using that for district energy. They're capturing it and reusing it. And that's really important because if you look at, this is what's called a Sankey diagram of the Canadian energy system. It shows the size of all of the energy that we're extracting and then producing and then that we're exporting. And what you can see at the bottom right-hand side is that there's these two thick gray lines and then there's an orange thick line on the right side. And what it shows is that we actually lose 2/3 of all energy across any economy, and it's lost as waste heat. And so the ability to capture waste heat and use it for heating rather than burning fossil fuels or using other forms of heat is extremely efficient. And this is what happens across all economies. It's not just the Canadian economy. It's basically how thermodynamics, how it happens. Okay, so a few quizzes. Is renewable energy market ready? The answer is yes. The International Energy Agency is considered a fairly conservative body, and according to their own data, and I've given the link, you can go and look it up, renewable energy is market ready, and it's actually many sources of renewable energy and renewable energy influencing technologies are more market ready than, for example, carbon capture, utilization, and storage, or nuclear small modular reactors. According to the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, there are currently 38 renewable energy technologies that are market ready, and they're not diffusing or scaling enough due to lack of policy support. And my research has documented that in Canada, for a low carbon or an environmental innovation to scale, for it to get past 15% market share is considered significant. And that's because it has to go against the traditional incumbent system, and it has to fit into a new system, which we don't quite have yet. Is renewable energy too expensive? This is another criticism. No. Right now, the cost of renewables have been falling dramatically for several years. At one point, the cost of solar fell like 80%, which is completely dramatic. Wind fell 26% within a few years, and the costs continued to fall. According to a recent publication, Nature Energy, which in my area is the big publication, renewable energy is now cheaper than coal, and we're seeing those numbers across a range of different organizations and outputs. Can we rely on 100% renewable energy? And the answer is yes. This is a very blunt analysis that was done years ago, but some researchers looked at Canada. They said, could we power Canada with renewable energy? There's way more renewable energy on the right-hand side than demand. It didn't take into account the electrification of transportation, but even so, we know that we can still do this. Can renewable energy generate revenue in Canada? This is a brand new study that came out recently in Energy Policy, authored by Sarah Hastings-Simon and some other co-authors. This is revenue from solar and wind electricity in Alberta from 2004 to 2022. So wind revenues have been slightly lower than average, but solar revenues have outpaced the average revenues. And so solar power can actually bring in revenues and be lucrative. Can renewable energy systems be reliable? This is another criticism, that the sun isn't always shining and the wind isn't always blowing. They can be, with the right design and more investment in innovation and diffusion. And so I've been following this for quite a while. We have engineers at UVic. There are many engineers who are modeling these types of systems. And we call them clusters of renewable energy. And basically what we're trying to do is bring together that whole ecosystem of technologies locally or far away, and find ways to have more reliability, which means that supply meets demand at every moment that we wish it to. But they can also be more resilient to environmental hazards, and that's really important too. So for example, if you have a heat wave in France and you don't have enough cold water to cool nuclear power plants, you'll have to shut them down. And that affects things like air conditioning and health outcomes. Renewable energy infrastructures are resilient in some of these hazardous events and including during extreme heat waves. Are we giving enough support to renewable energy to mitigate climate change? This is from the International Energy Agency, again, considered a fairly conservative organization. This is a scenario that they ran in their World Energy Outlook in 2017. They modeled current policies, and then they also modeled what you would need for what the Sustainable Development Goals, which goes beyond mitigating climate change. And you can see it in the orange box on the right. And what we see is consistent overspending on oil and gas and underspending on renewables, policies that support spending in oil and gas, and not enough policies that support renewables. So we know what we need to do, we're not doing it. Should I have updated it after COVID? The numbers are still not there. We're still not at the commitments. Our commitments are at about over 2 degrees right now, heading into the Conference of the Parties, rather than at the 1.5 that we should be at. I get this question a lot. What about critical mineral supply and human rights? Well, this is from a presentation I saw recently, and I recommend that you go and look up the work of Nem Singh, who's been publishing on this. And yes, renewable energy transitions will require new supply chains, investment in technological development for renewable energy, and that will involve many different countries that are going to have many different ways of managing mining, including Canada. Are we investing in innovation to find new materials for renewable energy supply? And so on the top right, whenever I hear criticisms of renewable energy, it's not doing this, it's not doing that, I bring you to our innovation diffusion curve. Our innovation diffusion curve is basically, how do we get new technology to market? Well, we invest in research, like at universities, to have new types of technology and innovations. So we do research and development, and then we do demonstration, deployment, and diffusion. Generally across the curve, if you look at the spending curve below, that is the spending curve for Canada for 40 years. It's approximately the same now. Spending on fossil fuels outpaces spending on renewables and energy efficiency by orders of magnitude, meaning by tens to hundreds to thousands of times. And I looked at the numbers again recently, and these are the numbers. So if you want to change something, you need to invest in the research side to get new tech. And if you want to have these technologies diffused into society, then you need to invest on the diffusion side. And we don't have enough input on either end of this life cycle for technology, especially in Canada. Okay, so now that I've gotten over the myths and context, let's talk about cities and energy. So I'm a researcher. I have a research question in a context that I'm really interested in. My engineering and geography brain got really interested in cities are increasingly adopting ambitious plans to rely on 100% renewable energy, often by 2050, sometimes by 2030 or 2040. And this includes Victoria, Saanich, and Vancouver in Canada. And so I was wondering, well, you know, cities don't have a whole lot of power to do things. Usually they're creatures of the province or of the national government. So how would they actually go about doing this? So my first question was, well, can they rely on renewable energy produced within their boundaries? Because at least they have a bit more influence on that. But if they can't do that, how can cities find the renewable energy they need to fulfill these pledges? And what does this mean for surrounding regions that cities sit within? So this is what I learned about cities. They account for over 2/3 of global carbon emissions and energy demand. Most of the growth of population is going to go into cities. Inside this circle is my city, that's my city boundary. So there's going to be population growth in cities, and this is really going to increase energy demand. Cities also occupy only 2% of the world's landmass. So you've got the majority of the population in a very tiny portion of landmass, and so they're very, very dense. Cities are where, when we decarbonize transportation and heating, for example, with electric vehicles and with heat pumps, those are mostly going to go into cities. And this means that electricity demand in cities is growing, and it's going to continue to grow a lot. What do I mean by that? An electric vehicle will use about 4 times the peak power of an average Toronto household. So every Toronto household that gets an electric vehicle and plugs it in, they will immediately increase the peak of their household energy use to 5 times what it originally was. And if you multiply that out by all the households or all of these high-rise buildings in a city, this is a massive amount of electricity demand. And so add on to that heat pumps, and you have the same thing where you've got a huge amount of electricity demand in a very small area. So electricity demand for vehicles and heating is expected to expand electricity systems overall. This is an example. I kind of got interested in this because I was teaching community energy planning in Toronto, and where I'm from, and I was living there for the last decade. And what happened in Toronto, this is the downtown of Toronto, and where you see these little blue-green things that says transformer, and we've got these arrows. And what happened in Toronto, if you haven't been there recently, is there was a condo boom. So all of these massive high-rises went into the downtown, right where they're showing this map. And that brought in all the people. And each condo high-rise is about the size of a small town, the population of a small town, with lots and lots of people in it, lots of heating and electricity use. And what happened was the city went to the power planner, system planner, and said, according to our modeling, the amount of energy that we're going to need inside the city is outpacing the amount of transmission that we can get of electricity we can get into the city. What are we going to do about this? And so that became a big issue in Toronto, and what it did was it pushed a lot of innovation in Toronto. And so what we're going to see, and what we are seeing right now, is in some of these really, really big dense cities where there's lots of growth, where we'll have electric vehicles. Yes, we will see new transmission lines, but we're also going to see a lot of innovation and a difference in terms of the ability to pay, because it costs a whole lot to put those transmission lines in. So there are new constraints that are happening in cities due to their growth. Okay. So now let's talk about renewable energy supply versus population location. And this is Canada where we are, but this is also the case in many other places. So in the maps on the outer edges, those are all maps of renewable energy potential. So I've got like biomass, I think I missed hydropower in this one. There's geothermal, there's solar, and there's wind. And so basically, the more intense the color gets, the more potential you have. Now, if you look at the map in the middle, that's where all of our population density is. And as the colors get darker, we have more dense population. And now that I'm in a geography department, maybe we can do some mapping of this. But what you can really see is that a lot of the potential for renewable energy does not overlap cities. And some of it is quite distant. For example, if you look at the amount of wind energy that can come from the north of Ontario and Manitoba and Quebec, whereas we have population centers all the way down in southern Ontario. Okay, I love this chart. Not everybody's going to love this chart, but this chart explains everything, and it's from Václav Smil. So what this chart shows is, if you're numerically inclined, is on the y-axis, it shows the power density of demand or supply. And the power density explains a lot about this renewable energy transition and these city transitions and the geography of renewable energy transitions. So it's in watts, so the amount of energy used or produced per meter square, so per area. And it's on a logarithmic scale, so it'll go to 1, and then 10, and then 100, and then 1,000, and so on. And across the y-axis we have area. and that's also on a logarithmic scale, and it's in meters squared. So just a few things to point out on this chart. On the right-hand side, I've got cities inside a circle, and cities are pretty big. They're very, very large area. They're somewhat dense in terms of the energy demand. What we have, if you go up to the top left, we have the world's tallest building. We have high-rise buildings. Next to it, we also have refineries and steel mills. And what we find with those is that they're not huge in terms of their land footprint, but they really demand very dense energy. So the amount of energy they demand in an area is quite a bit. Then as we move further down, where the other circle is on the left in the middle, you see things like rooftop photovoltaic, solar hot water heaters. Next to it, you see solar farms, you see heat pumps, you'll see large hydroelectric stations going further to the right because they're big. And the energy density of those are much smaller. They're orders of magnitude lower than that needed for high-rise buildings or refineries. And what that really means is that when you do a balance, you're going to need more surface area if you power these things through solar and wind and renewables than what the area that those installations take up. So what we have is a situation where the energy density of cities is going up and the energy density of our supply is going down. And this is really going to shift land use and the relationships between different areas. And these are order of magnitude differences. I tried to explain it a little bit in this graph. So again, I've got a logarithmic scale for watts, the amount of energy. And then on the x-axis, I've got basically the different size of different types of technologies. So you can see solar panels, I looked them up. They're up to like 300 watts in a solar panel. A wind turbine is 10 kilowatts up to 4 megawatts. A megawatt is 1,000 watts. Now they might be up to 10 megawatts. Fossil fuel thermal plants are between about 100 kilowatts and gigawatt level. Hydropower is between a megawatt to 6 gigawatts. And nuclear power plants are between about 500 megawatts to 4 gigawatts. And the Canadian electricity system is 145 gigawatts. What does that mean? Let's say we decommission a coal-fired power plant that's in the order of like 4 megawatts, so that's 4,000 watts. And we want to replace it with turbines that are 4 megawatts. And turbines with their capacity factor might only produce about a third of that. Then you have to replace, say, a 4 megawatt nuclear power plant or a 4 gigawatt nuclear power plant with several hundred wind turbines. And those will have a much larger land area than what the nuclear power plant has. And that's what we're talking about, or the coal-fired power plant actually, that's what we're talking about in terms of all of these transitions, is that we're now expanding the amount of land use that we need in order to meet demand. So renewable energy in the city is a regional issue. Why is that? So when we started this, it just seemed really obvious to me, like I was an engineer and a geographer. I had that chart from Vaclav Smil. I was like, this is so obvious. Like, we're going to be using a lot of land in order to produce enough renewable energy to power cities that are growing. And I was like, how is this even going to happen? This is a major technological challenge, but it's also actually a major social and economic challenge. And I want to talk about that. So there's only really been a partial understanding of the potential options and impacts of renewable energy transitions for these cities that are declaring we're going to go 100% renewable energy. So we know energy density of renewable energy is orders of magnitude lower than that of the demand of urban areas. I checked, there's been very little analysis as to whether cities can be self-sufficient in terms of renewable energy. I found like 5 studies. Most of them said no. Even with smart grid technology, they cannot be self-sufficient. And what that means is they will have to rely on imports of energy into their city boundaries, which is why I keep drawing this city boundary around them. In a lot of studies, like Chris Kennedy, who's one of my colleagues here, they'll just leave it exogenous. They'll say, okay, well, city power supply needs to decarbonize, but they don't explain how that might happen. So as I was looking at this, no one ever really made the connect the dots piece, but one paper said, well, urban energy transitions are simply impossible without rural energy transitions. So this is what we're looking at in my little animation. We've got all of our growth, and so then I'm not seeing it there very well, but we'll build renewable energy outside of the cities. That renewable energy will go into the city, and the city will be paying money outside of the city. And so these are going to be new economic relationships that are going to form in terms of where we're getting our energy from, particularly as we decarbonize transportation and heating. Sorry, I can't see the slides, so I went a little out of order there. I won't go into the whole study, but we looked at the 47 of the most ambitious renewable energy plans in the world, and we coded them. And we theorized that this was the case, and we found, yes, in practice, this is the case. So what we have in the orange pieces are city renewable energy plans that either state explicitly that they will rely on renewable energy from the region, and or state explicitly that they have regional and district partners involved in these plans. And we looked at these, and so what we found was that, for example, in many places, regional and district authorities are involved, there's municipal ownership of utilities, and we found what we would call new interscalar and economic relationships between cities and surrounding communities. So cities, one example would be in some Australian cities, citizens in the city are investing in renewable energy outside of the city to be generated and brought back into the city. And that's happening in a few different places. However, there are a lot of places like Victoria, Saanich, and Vancouver that are relying on centralized approaches because we are relying here on BC Hydro. So what we did was we theorized it and then we confirmed, yes, this is happening in practice. So the question then we have to ask is, if we want to have this renewable energy transition, we want to mitigate climate change, and we've got this whole technical issue ahead of us, like how is this even going to happen technologically? But the next question is, why would regions even want to produce renewable energy for cities? This is a question we should all be asking ourselves, because there's a lot of social opposition to renewable energy that we see in certain contexts, and then in other contexts that I'm going to talk about, communities want renewable energy. And so I'm going to end with an example of communities that want renewable energy and what that means. So there was a meta-study that looked at 30 years of renewable energy projects, and what they found was that social acceptance of renewable energy by communities occurred where renewable energy, by communities where renewable energy is cited, is tied to the distribution of socioeconomic benefits, fairness, participation, and trust during the development process. The thing about socioeconomic benefits, though, is that they are often modeled on the regional and national scale. And I've spoken to modelers last year. I felt like I was going down a rabbit hole. No, you could model it on a local scale, but you're not going to get very good results, and they're not reliable, and it would be a huge amount of money and effort. So my research is now looking at how can we measure fairly and consistently the socioeconomic benefits of renewable energy to local communities. So these benefits are not thoroughly documented, but they can include things like economic development revenue, renewable energy acceptance, capacity development, socioeconomic regeneration, knowledge and skills development, social capital, access to affordable energy, empowerment, and so on. But we don't know that this is consistently the case. So again, why would regions want to produce renewable energy for cities? So let's go into, there's a theory around community energy, which is what my research lab studies and considers. So on this chart, on the y-axis we have the process of how this renewable energy project is brought about. Is it open and participatory, or is it closed and institutional? So is there fairness and transparency in the process? And then we have the outcome, which is on the x-axis. Is it distant and private, or is it local and collective? So according to community energy theory, social acceptance is tied to control of decision-making and the local benefits of renewable energy. But there's also part of this theory of communities of place, which is the community where renewable energy is sited and where people might come together and produce their own renewable energy. But in this case, we're actually talking about communities of interest. And these are networked communities. And this is the case if we're in a city and we go and invest in renewable energy in a region, we're a community of interest investing in a community of place. It's another place, and we're doing that for our own benefit. So the socioeconomic benefits of either local or networked communities have not been consistently documented. And this impedes our understanding of how to design good policy to encourage social acceptance. And we need social acceptance so that we can have the renewable energy so that we can mitigate climate change. Documenting the local benefits of renewable energy. So this is sort of just where we're at right now. We just published this paper where we looked at, well, what are the documented benefits of renewable energy to local communities that we call community of place or COP. And there were a lot, but the top ones were helping to educate and promote environmental energy citizenship and behavior, new sources of local income, jobs, facilities, skill, and capacity development, but also it generated higher support for renewable energy, increased participation, benefits for affected communities, and it goes on and on and on. You can see there's a really long list of documented benefits, although they're not consistently seen across all of the studies. Sometimes they're documented in only one study. And a lot of the studies are sort of ad hoc in the way that they're documenting these, and we need to address that in research. When we look at the benefits of networked renewable energy, so that's renewable energy that's controlled more by these outside external networks, we see that there are less benefits overall. There's also less studies overall. So we understand this even less than we understand what's happening in local communities where the renewable energy is sited. But a really big piece of it is that it's expanding the reach of public support and public's participation. It can also help with capacity and improve inclusion in some of these. And then finally, what about looking at the benefits where we combine local and networked communities? So we have communities that are far working with communities where the renewables are locally sited. And what they find here, again, there are far less studies on this, but this is what we really need to know as the next step. And we find, for example, the biggest finding is the ability to mainstream these projects and help with industry concerns like local opposition, the ability to find funding, the best technological rollout, and so on. But again, a lot of these are only showing an N of 1 or 2 of the benefits, and they're just not clearly documented. In our study, we asked, so what would affect the socioeconomic outcomes of renewable energy transitions for cities and surrounding communities? And what we came up with was a synthesis of factors that together would impact the socioeconomic outcomes that we are interested in. So these are going to be things like regional land use and trade-offs, the regional infrastructure. Where do we have power lines and transmission lines going? And one example is that recently a major transmission line is being developed in Ontario, and it has equity ownership by Indigenous communities, a whole bunch of Indigenous communities. And that's a totally new institutional structure because you have multiple communities investing in a transmission line. There's also what we call, this is economic geography talk, but the spatial agglomeration smart specialization of firms. So where are all the firms that are going to help the renewable energy go in, that are going to bring in these renewable energy technologies, that are going to bring in the know-how, and where are they related in relation to the city or in relation to these rural communities? And then the other piece is the actor involvement. So which actors are involved? And again, what we found before, regional districts and authorities, neighboring communities, and the city. And what we found was that in quite a few places in Europe, but not all, and also quite a few places in the US, it's the planning is happening at the county or the district or the regional level, as opposed to at the national scale or at the local scale. And then finally, we found that depending on the actors involved, whether they're civic actors or public actors, such as local authorities, private citizens, private companies, major corporations, those are all going to affect the socioeconomic outcomes. So now I want to talk about justice in energy transitions, because this is what this is really about. If we start to bring benefits to communities, then maybe we're starting to think about how we're distributing the benefits of this energy transition. So some people will say, well, we should just mitigate climate change, and other people will say, well, we need to address the justice aspects, and we need to address those as a core part of this transition. Why is this important? This transition requires unprecedented investments in distribution systems and new supply. It's estimated to cost anywhere between 23 trillion and 130 trillion globally, which is a huge amount of investment. We also know that the spatial rollout of renewable energy has equity impacts, and there are equity trade-offs between locations where they go. And so an important question that we've been asking in my research lab is who leads and who benefits? There are challenges to decentralization. This is a very messy process. Renewable energy transitions are a technological, economic, and political decentralization. So we're at the top, we're moving away from that centralized piece down to the bottom, where lots and lots of different actors at different scales of government and different types of communities and different voting structures are all involved in where we are going to site and locate all of this. And this is producing conflicts and compromises between incumbent players like utilities and new actors who are citizens and local governments and communities. And oftentimes what I find really interesting is I'll talk to communities and community actors, and they'll say the incumbent utility is blocking us, it's so unfair, and it's not unique to your community, it's not unique to your context, it's actually happening everywhere. And this is because this is a major paradigm shift, and it requires fundamental change in regulatory structures to procure and provide energy. And this creates a power struggle between the incumbent utilities that are going to need to change. They can't do business as usual anymore. Replacing that coal-fired power plant is actually pretty hard. And between the new actors that are trying to create change, who are trying to do the right thing. So it's a political transition. And I was looking at, there's something called the utility death spiral, and I did an image search. For a utility, it can feel like a tumble. It can feel like a free fall tumble, where they're in the darkness and they don't quite know where to land. Whereas for the public, this was in teen vogue. All of us working in community energy were like, whoa, we made it in teen vogue. But whereas the public are saying, enough with all of these hazards and outages, we need to take control of our utilities, of our energy, and fight the climate crisis. So this is a very common struggle and challenge that's happening in pretty much all locations around the world to varying degrees, and it's not unique to any location. Another issue that I deal with is around diversity in energy. Energy sector is responsible for 80% of global greenhouse gas emissions. It is the problem in climate change, and yet it is the least diverse sector that I'm aware of. Right now, we've reached 32% women globally, and the percentage of women diminishes at every career progression. We have even less people of color, and even less Indigenous people involved in renewable energy transitions. It is not a diverse sector. The McConnell Foundation had my lab run a research project where we looked at equity, diversity, and inclusion in the net zero carbon economy in Canada. And what we found was that the vast majority, and I mean the vast majority, like close to 300 out of over 400 organizations that are engaged do not appear to be led by historically marginalized groups, and only approximately half of those are addressing historically marginalized groups explicitly. Again, we looked at websites. They might be doing more, but we figure if they're doing something, they're bragging about it. And so we didn't find evidence of that. We found evidence of very few organizations led by youth, Indigenous people, racialized, immigrant, low-income, disability, seniors. Northern and coastal communities were found in the net zero carbon economy landscape, and this was confirmed by knowledgeable stakeholders that we ran workshops with. It was unclear to us if this is because there are few organizations in the net zero carbon economy led by historically marginalized groups, or whether they're just not often recognized or funded for the work that they do. But considering that we went to stakeholders and asked who are we missing, we think we covered it. And Pavel, who's sitting over there, ran some numbers for me, and he found that groups that are led by historically marginalized groups are 3 times less likely to get funding from foundations than groups that are what we call conventional. So we have a number of initiatives and organizations. I co-founded WISER, which is the light bulb on the right, Women in Inclusivity and Sustainable Energy Research, to combat the complete dearth of women who are doing sustainable energy research, even though we're here to train the next generation of people who are going to work in this sector. There's the Equal by 30 campaign, the Donors of Color Network, Leadership Accord on Gender Diversity, but we are not really making enough progress right now, I would say. And this is the system that is really impacting the world the most. I've been working with Anna Burka, who's a professor at Massey University in New Zealand, on this. And what she's been documenting is what would be the institutional supports, the pyramid of supports that we would need in order to support these projects so that communities gain control and socioeconomic benefits. And so she found this pyramid of 7 pieces. So the first piece, and we need this in order, because we lack a set of tools for explanatory factors for the emergence of locally controlled renewable energy and the associated socioeconomic benefits. And this answers the question, how do we create local benefits and inclusive institutional support? So at the bottom of the pyramid, it's ensuring the viability of independent power projects that provide power, heat, or ancillary services. So these are things like market access and legal frameworks. Then we have structural policies that enable social innovation. So these are resource planning, legal frameworks for mutual ownership. And then we have things like setting precedent, seeding capability, and legitimacy. So access to finance, local capacity and resources, but also building a positive narrative. So we've applied for money to try to apply this framework. So hopefully we'll get the funding to test this out and see what we come up with. So I'm going to finish with a case study about benefits and local ownership and control from regions for city renewable energy transitions. And oftentimes I get asked about public opposition, lack of support, that type of thing. And I want to talk about the opposite. I want to talk about communities that want to generate renewable energy and talk about why. So although some communities in Canada are concerned about renewable energy and sometimes opposing it, many Indigenous communities view renewable energy as an opportunity for local economic development, and they want to address the looming supply crunches associated with electrification of transportation and heat, and lead the way in a renewable energy transition. And so recently, for example, there was a report, First Nation Leadership in BC's Renewable Energy Future. In Saskatchewan, there's an organization called the First Nations Power Authority, and they are there to help First Nations and Métis communities to develop renewable energy projects. The Canadian Climate Institute released a report called Waves of Change. So there's a shifting understanding of this, but still I think we need more of an understanding. So this could be why. It could be because so we've got over 600 Indigenous communities that are Inuit, Métis, and First Nation, and actually probably over 700. Indigenous people have been displaced and excluded by settler colonial infrastructures and institutions, and they experience energy poverty, child poverty, poor health conditions, and disparities and disadvantages in every conceivable indicator of well-being. And although they have different conceptions of what this means, reconciliation is about rebuilding relationships between Indigenous and settler people. And renewable energy for reconciliation has become a major topic of public discourse and research in the last few years. And I've contributed a few research papers to it. So what you see on the right is a map of traditional lands and territories associated with different Indigenous communities and nations. And it covers basically the entire territory of Canada and where all of that renewable energy potential lies. So the thing about local renewable energy, as you saw from above, it's that it's actually dependent on state actors and support. And so the broader institutional structure that you're operating in is really going to set the pace for what emerges and what succeeds in that setting. The thing is, settler colonialism continues to structure the broader set of relations in which renewable energy projects are situated. This is through the Constitution, the Indian Act, and a patchwork of treaties, unceded land, land claims, settlement agreements, and Indigenous communities' own legal orders and traditions, which are not structured by settler colonial institutions and which they would rather implement. When I first started learning about this, it was because I had a law and master's student who insisted on working with me and insisted that we work on community energy and Indigenous communities in Canada. And because she's a lawyer, she said to me, every time we talked about it, don't forget, ultimately, the Crown retains control through veto rights. It doesn't matter what type of governance structure you have, the Crown will always maintain control through veto rights. And that's something that has always stuck with me, and I continue to think about. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission report laid out 94 calls to action endorsing UNDRIP. And so I was trying to understand, well, what is the connection between community energy and between reconciliation? And we think that it comes down to land. So remember how we talk about local communities and networked communities, but Indigenous people don't really fall into that because they've been displaced into places that may not have been their area and off of their own traditional lands and not having rights to control the total area of their traditional land. So Articles 26, 28, and 29 of UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, outlines their rights to the control and development of the lands, territories to which they belong, including those confiscated resources, as well as the right to protect and conserve the environment, along with the importance of free, prior, and informed consent to any future activities that take place on these lands. So that was our connection. Indigenous people have community energy through their rights to their traditional lands and having control over them. So with Alicia Campney, this master's student at the time who's now graduated, and support from another master's student, Katarina Savic, the two of them made a database. Alicia made a database of 194 projects with some form of Indigenous community involvement. And we think that these were all of the major projects in Canada. We asked, are the projects on traditional land or on a reserve or settlement? Because traditional land is an indicator of rights under UNDRIP, and reserve land is an indicator of less control because it's settler colonial outcomes. We asked if they were First Nation, Inuit, or Métis, and we looked at control. Did they have equity ownership, which is stronger control and socioeconomic benefits? Or did they have less than 100% ownership, and what percentage? Or did they have memorandum of understanding, resource revenue, or benefits agreements, which were all considered weaker control, especially because they're not transparent. And we argued that reconciliation means equity ownership of projects on traditional lands. Now this is a very quantitative analysis, so you could go back and run interviews, which we did later on, which might find some differences, but in our interviews we ran later on, the answer was 50% partnership or better. And that's all we're gonna accept. And that's what a lot of Indigenous people say in the media. Oh. What did we find? So we found that most of the projects that were wholly Indigenous owned on the top left were within the Indigenous community. So they were on the reserve or the settlement created by the settler colonial state. Then we looked at whether they were on traditional land, and we found that the majority of those on traditional land had little to no Indigenous ownership. So then the reviewers said to us, well, there are different stages of, access to rights that Indigenous people had. So maybe, people asked, maybe it improved over time. But the answer is it didn't improve over time. We can see here in the numbers that still most of the projects did not have majority ownership by Indigenous communities. So these results created a little bit of a ruffle, I would say, because there was a lot of public association of renewable energy with reconciliation, and our results say, well, maybe not, and our follow-up results say equity ownership and partnerships are what Indigenous communities associate with reconciliation, and also they want self-determination. I realize I'm going a bit over time, but I hope this is worth it. This is my last piece, which is about partnership research we're doing right now. Clean Energy BC came to my lab and said, hey, we got this contract, we got a grant, we'd like you to run research for us. And this is in partnership with New Relationship Trust, which is an Indigenous organization that works with all First Nations in BC. It's also with Pembina Institute and the University of Victoria. The project's called Capacity Development Research and Advocacy for Indigenous and Remote Clean Energy. And the New Relationship Trust and Clean Energy BC have been engaging with 92 First Nations and Indigenous organizations in BC. There are 200 First Nations in BC, just to give you a bit of context on how large that size is. And the grant is working on a number of things, but what we will be working on is research on Indigenous participation in the clean energy industry. And what does that mean? Well, remember how we haven't really documented clearly the socioeconomic benefits of renewable energy. And this project is actually driven by Indigenous communities who are saying, hey, give us a chance, let us produce renewable energy for local economic development. So clearly there's something to that, if they're asking to do that. So we will be documenting, and we're doing this right now, we're submitting ethics tomorrow. What are the socioeconomic benefits from renewable energy that First Nations communities have experienced? And this is going to produce knowledge for better research, because globally we need to do better in terms of what we're producing, how we document it, what are agreed upon ways to document these benefits. We also need this for policy design. When I speak with policymakers, a lot of them are really interested in these integrated assessment models, which are very helpful for carbon emissions, but they're not helpful to understand how this is going to roll out across communities. And a lot of policymakers don't know how this is going to impact communities, and it would help them make better policy and decisions if they did. It will also, and we will not be developing this business case, but it will also support the development of a business case and a regulatory case for something called the First Nations Power Authority in BC. And this is being described to me as a way to support First Nation owned and created entities that would enjoy certain opportunities such as calls and transmission use, and serve as a First Nation-led engine of reconciliation-driven economic opportunity in the energy sectors, the benefits being enjoyed by the member bands. And what this would allow would be things like those longer transmission lines, deciding where they go with communities collectively, and then allowing those communities to decide where they want renewable energy for local economic development that's in line with their own values and worldviews. And this would also support the looming supply crunch because many different jurisdictions are adopting heat pumps and electric vehicles. And so the demand for electricity is not just going to go up in BC, but it's going to go up in surrounding areas where BC might be trading with, and this is going to be the case for most electricity grids and systems. I have to read this last one off the top. So broadly, we need to move away from these bounded methods of analysis and thinking, because generally we always think in terms of the local or the regional or the national, but we're not thinking in terms of these new interscalar relationships between actors within cities and neighboring communities. So we need to document and learn from communities that are already doing this and those working to make change, which is what we're doing with this project. And we also need to work with a wide range of communities to develop new institutions for new economic relationships, because we know that that's what we need to have happen in order to have this renewable energy transition happen. And I applied for that in a grant, and I'm hoping the funder agrees and gives us the funds in March or something like that. And that's my talk. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much. We do have time for questions.
I think about a place like Los Angeles, which is already having shortages of energy. So in a sense, we're already seeing it. And what a draw, so to speak. It's such a large area. It's basically the size of Canada, the California market. So they're already running low. And I'm not sure how they're plugging that gap. I had heard at one point that Site C was basically BC Hydro wanting to sell power down the western seaboard. But we can't keep doing things like that.
It's a really good case to bring up. So Los Angeles is really, really interesting. So when we published that paper, what happened was we met C40 Cities, and C40 Cities had just published a report about how coal in regions, and we met, and then Los Angeles came up in our study, and they are working with Los Angeles right now. So Los Angeles is like a pretty big case. And the next speaker, by the way, is from C40 Cities, David Miller.
Okay.
Los Angeles owns its own electricity utility municipally, and so that's really significant. And what's happening is Los Angeles has become a critical case study in all of this, because they are trying to source 100% renewable energy, and they are dealing now with regions. And so when we told C40 Cities, well, this is what we're looking at, they said, well, Los Angeles would love to learn from this, and how can we start to develop networks? And so we've written up some of this in a knowledge hub for C40 cities. And I know that Los Angeles is actually being studied in terms of how they're going about getting to this gap. So that's the piece around, they have municipal ownership, so they have a little bit more control municipally around that plan and how they're going to go about doing it. The other piece is that if you look at the First Nations in BC report that came out, the research we're doing is like the next phase related to that report. And that report talks about the BC power supply. California has just mandated, they have this most stringent mandate now for zero emission vehicles, which means there's going to be a lot more electric vehicles on their grid fairly soon. So that's going to create more demand. So if you look at the north-south trading happening, the research we're doing is in anticipation of the fact that not only is there going to be more demand on the broader power grid in California for electricity, but there will also be more demand from Vancouver and from cities like Victoria on the power grid for electricity. So the research we're doing is for First Nations to position themselves for these changes and be ready with a solution for some of these supply crunches. Yeah.
Other questions?
I can continue on with the West. I think of other sources, Site C, that's a bigger one, but akin to that, like the Columbia River generates the most power for a river in the U.S., probably North America maybe. And a lot of rivers have dams on them, but there's also a move to remove dams. A lot of dams are being removed from rivers for various reasons. Sometimes they simply silt up and they're no longer performing their function, but other times it's to restore runs, fisheries runs, and things like that, to try to regain a little bit of ecological balance for regions.
Yeah.
That would almost seem to be an effort or a movement counter to providing more renewable sources. We're almost cutting into that supply. But
I think,
again, not much of a question.
yeah, no, it is a question. I mean, the thing that we think about in our research, and for example, like women in inclusivity and sustainable energy research, we're membership based. So you have to apply to be in our group, and then we said, well, what is our membership base? What does justice mean? And free, prior, and informed consent, for example, is part of justice to us. So hydro is, it depends. Like, it depends if it's flooding ecosystems and creating difficult circumstances for communities, and communities don't want them, or they could be providing benefits to communities and not affecting fish populations, which is the case with some run-of-river hydro. So with hydro, it really, really depends. And there are a lot of of hydro projects that have terrible environmental impacts. And so removing those might not be a bad idea, because just because it's renewable doesn't mean it's good. And part of social acceptance is around, a lot of people are concerned about their local environmental impacts, and they're also concerned about benefits and having control over where it's sited. And again, I think having more possibilities and more institutional, and just even understanding the process of, like, how would we put down a new transmission line with lots of new renewables from lots of communities? How would we engage? Like, having those models would be really helpful. Sort of, it's kind of a roundabout way of answering that, because I'm not familiar with the cases of dams being taken down, but there's going to be so much heterogeneity in what's out there. Yeah. I'm happy to answer all questions. No question is too small. So,
Just kind of on hydro as well. The royalty system that BC uses is very, it doesn't consider a lot of factors like water security, things like that. And it's kind of designed to artificially lower hydro prices, like for the province as a whole. So have you kind of looked into community benefits from certain like royalty schemes for like land use or water use, for bigger projects like hydro or big wind farms?
no, for two reasons. One, I haven't been here that long. The other is that, again, if I'm understanding correctly, what we're interested in is around communities having control over the projects and equity ownership over them, and not having impact and benefit agreements necessarily. We know that in the case of First Nations, of Indigenous people, that's what they want. They want equity ownership. So I would say the governance structure there is potentially the issue. The other issue is that, again, with these regulatory structures, we have a legacy system of regulatory structures and fee structures that were for empty world, and now we're in full world economics. My ecological economist is saying this. Like, we've got big populations, we have big energy use, and we need to rethink those. We need to rethink energy demand as well in a really big way. So for example, I don't own a car. I think electric vehicles are a pretty good idea, but I think we should get more people on bicycles and active transportation and public transportation, because we need to lower energy demand overall. So I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
I guess I had one question. At the beginning of your talk, you mentioned these three different types of grids: the super grid, the smart grid, and the microgrids, I think. And I was wondering if you could speak to how those three types of grids kind of relate to one another. So, for instance, one of my neighbors recently put a lot of solar panels on his roof, and I guess there are some contexts where they can kind of sell back some of that energy to the wider grid. Or could you maybe talk about the relation between the microgrids and the larger scale grids, and
So we're studying that kind of in the lab right now. We don't know all the answers. There's a few reasons. One is that because of these incumbent challenges, some of these microgrid projects have been kind of pushed down. And so, for example, there haven't been as many demonstration projects as we would like on some of these types of microgrids and their emergence. They're doing net metering, and there's a lot of different complicated things that can happen with all of these things. So the best way that I can describe it is that with renewable energy, the best thing you can have is a lot of diversity of innovations and tech in the ecosystem. So you always want to cluster tech, which is what we're studying in the lab. So one example would be, it's not enough to put solar panels on your roof and then rely on those. Those are not really going to get you that far because of what I talked about. They're not generating enough power for you. What you really want to do is make where you live as efficient as you possibly can. And I used to write about deep energy retrofits to buildings, and government has now taken that up, so I'm like, okay, I can move on. Deep energy retrofits can get you 50 to 80% reduction in energy use in your building, but it'll also depend on your behavior. Like, do you crank the temperature now that it's super efficient? But if you really, really reduce your energy use, then you can, those solar panels can produce, say, more of what you need. You'll also be able to produce resilience in the region. So let's say one region's not producing enough energy, the supergrids could bring in energy from another region. There's things called complementarity, which is about how sources produce energy at different times of day. And the more that you combine different sources, the cheaper the overall system costs go down. because then you're not relying on tons, like a huge energy storage thing and a huge solar panel to get the energy you need. Now you're relying on, like, you've got some solar, you've got some wind, energy efficiency, and then you can have maybe biofuels, and then you can have a smaller battery. So with all of these things, and then between the microgrid and, say, the main grid and the supergrid is really about distance. And there are conflicts and compromises there too. So for example, there are ideas about putting a supergrid from a desert all the way to with lots of solar panels in a desert, and then bringing that power thousands of kilometers to a center of demand. It really depends. In the case of microgrids, what they have found, because so many places are coastal, they can provide a lot more resilience, and also there are ideas around bringing microgrids to basically community centers, so that if there's a storm, you'll have the most reliable energy in a community center, maybe not in individual households. So what we really need is variety of innovation, doing lots of clusters of things, variety of thinking about it, and thinking in terms of resilience. I hope that answers the question. It's fairly complicated, and we don't know all the answers, but the answer really is multi-scalar, resilient diversity.
We have time for a few more questions if anyone has any.
No one from this side of the room here? Yeah.
There's no bad question.
I have one question about social acceptance. Maybe it is so simple. I want to just know what is effect on social acceptance in city.
What's the research on social acceptance in cities?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, in cities, they don't produce as much renewable energy, really. So there's going to be a lot less. They will have different types of installations happening in cities, but to be honest, cities are mostly going to be doing energy efficiency and conservation activities for the most part, because they just demand so much energy. So when I lived in Toronto, I lived in a LEED Gold building because it was the most efficient, and we had district energy, which is a much more efficient way of bringing about heating and cooling into buildings. But I haven't seen as much on that in terms of building installations, but the impacts would, the ideas around transparency and fairness and procedural fairness, those would all apply. And probably also a lot more city planning and urban planning principles, and there's a lot more around integrating energy plans into official municipal plans in cities, because what they're realizing now is that cities really impact energy supply and also or energy use and supply and where it can go, and so they're doing it much more through merging official plans. Yeah, but hard to say. In Victoria, I was asking around, like, is there a commercial scale, renewable energy installation that I can get a photo with? And I asked all the experts, and there are none that any experts were aware of. So I found that kind of fascinating because Victoria has a renewable energy plan. So yeah, it's I hope that answers your question to as much as I can say. Yeah. Yeah.
So if a city has a renewable energy plan, but they don't have any renewable energy, then what is in that plan?
There is a plan for solar rooftop. So and also working with BC Hydro, I think, and Fortis BC. But yeah, I think the way cities are working is it's mostly through the official municipal plan and integrating between energy and municipal planning. And that's a whole other thing too. It's a whole other skill set between where engineers and planners are working together. It's complex. It's really, there's a lot happening in the world. Yeah.
Any other questions? Okay, well, let's thank Dr. Christina Hoicka for an engaging talk. And before you leave, I just want to plug our next speaker. As Christina already mentioned, David Miller is the Managing Director of C40 Center for City Climate Policy and Economy, and he's also the former mayor of Toronto. So hopefully you can make it on November 17th here in the Legacy Gallery. Have a great night, everyone. I'll see you next time.